So much, Daryl, and so glad to be back. I know this isn't the easiest topic. It's a very heavy topic, and it's a very personal topic to many of us. When, as I said last week, when we started talking about doing these kinds of talks with Daryl and Knowledge is Power, talking about mental health and stress is so timely given the pandemic. But even prior to the pandemic, a lot of us are carrying a lot of weight on our shoulders. And I'd like to say most of us know how to deal with it well, but the reality is we are seeing an epidemic in mental health and physical health problems and disorders because we aren't dealing with the level of stress in our lives as effectively as we should. One of the things that always comes up when we talk about the science behind what stress does to us, I always like to talk about it in terms of we as a species haven't evolved in many ways as well as we should. And the one area that we haven't is dealing with stress. Many years ago, when we were a newly formed species, we developed biological mechanisms to deal with, oh, I got to run from this really large animal in front of me. But over time, I mean, fast forward to where we are today, that same biology gets us through stressful events. But the problem is our stress level is always in that high activation between work, life, family, demands, and now this pandemic. Our body is in this really high activation that we can't settle down from effectively. So tonight, after that really heavy topic of what stress is and how we deal with it, tonight let's talk about all of the positive things that we can do to help us navigate all of the things that life throws at us. And it's not to say that stress isn't going to come into our lives and it's not going to rock us at our core. It will. It will at some point in all of our lives affect us in one way or another. But we can do things in a routine or on a daily basis that can help us navigate when those events come forward in our lives. And tonight, let's talk about the science behind what we call resiliency. I actually like to use a different term. I like to use grit. And grit seems to resonate with me. I grew up in a really small town in Nova Scotia, and the type of community I grew up in, it's hard to describe, but people had grit. And I didn't know that until later in my career when I started looking at all of the things that we can do from building resiliency. And when I looked back, I go, the village I grew up set a foundation for me that I do practice in my day to day lives. And it really comes down to tenacity, mental toughness, those things that when, very difficult things happen, you hunker down and you go, okay, what do I need to do to effectively get through this? So tonight, we're going to talk about the science. And before we start, resiliency, we often think of dealing effectively with stressful events, the challenges of life, and how effective that can be. And we often sometimes think some people are better at it than others. Well, we are, because it's a skill. It is no different from playing the piano, learning a new sport, learning creative writing, whatever an outlet may be, you're only as good as the effort you put into it. And resiliency is a lot like that as well. Some people have more innate qualities, but we all can learn how to live resilient life if we put the work in. And resiliency also takes stress, trauma, negative things. We have to experience that before we learn to know how to get through it effectively. So resiliency requires the hard times in life. Last week, the one of the pieces I left our discussion on was talking about reserves, like how much reserves we have at any one time to withstand all the pressures that life has thrown at us. And in times when our reserves are low, it is that much more challenging to use strategies effectively. But the more we practice them, the easier they become. They become ingrained. They become something that we fall into and we often don't even realize we're falling into. So we do need the stress and trauma, but we also need to be aware of, last time this worked for me. Or even more effectively, you look to friends, family, colleagues when they are going through difficult times and try to understand the strategies they've used. Whatever the tool it is to learn how to get through hard times, use it. So, to talk about the science part, we've come a long way in understanding the role that resiliency plays in our life. And a lot of the research has come from policing backgrounds, military backgrounds, but it's applicable in everybody's life. It doesn't matter what role you're doing from a work perspective or at a home perspective. This research can definitely help steer you developing a resilient mindset. So there's two wonderful researchers that I'm going to pull most of the research descriptions from. One is an individual who's based here in Canada. He's the research chair in resiliency research out of Dalhousie University. Dr. Michael Unger has put together a synthesis of information of why resiliency and what factors really work. And I'm going to summarize very briefly just some elements that he says are so important for each of us to build that resiliency lifestyle. The one element that he did really focus upon is, although the work to change ourselves and our mindset comes from within, but we also have to take into account all of the resources around us. What is the structure around us? And we can't do it alone. We need the world to align sometimes to make it easier for us. And he says if we focus on the world around us much more than focusing on ourselves, resiliency comes more naturally. But he did say we need a few things ourselves. So here they are. He says we need structure. And that makes sense. And I don't know how many others can relate to this. But the one thing that the pandemic has done for me and many of the people I talk to, it has completely upset our structure. Before the pandemic, I had an office job. I would go in at a certain time, I'd have a routine, and my day would start. Well, now my day doesn't start in the same way. Do I always sit in front of my computer in my pajamas? Probably more than I would care to admit. But my routine is off. And I started in the months after working from home, I realized if I don't start getting back into a regular structure of when I would get up, what I would put on, what routine I would take in the morning, if on the days that I even delay, putting on makeup or taking that shower in the morning, I'm not quite the same because it's outside of my routine. So every night, setting up the expectations of the next day from a structure perspective helps us have that resilient mindset right from the moment your eyes wake up in the morning. Why that works is during a crisis, during stressful time, structure is important because it buffers the chaos that's going on. It makes us feel like our life is predictable. So structure is very important. Dr. Unger always also said that we need consequences. Making mistakes is something we all do. And making mistakes is sometimes very difficult to own up to. But if we're going to be successful, we have to make a mistake at some point in our life. Because when we suffer consequences, it makes opportunities to change and grow more manageable. What we do wrong and how we interpret how and why we've done wrong integrates us how to figure out how to succeed and not make that same mistake again. So making mistakes is actually needed to build that resilient mindset. The third factor Dr. Unger explains is that we need intimate and sustaining relationships. We need, even if it's one person in our life who loves us unconditionally, that is an important foundation for resiliency. We are social creatures. We look for others for support and guidance. What is important, though, is that this individual may not be in our life right now. They may have passed on, or they may be even just geographically separated from us. The memory of once being loved and being important in other people's lives is a really good buffer to withstand the pressures of life and build that resilient mindset. But we also need lots of relationships. We have so many different types of relationships that do certain things for us. We have certain people who share our concerns, our problems, our hopes, our dreams. We have others that provide laughter. We have other people who provide guidance and advice for us. So we need a lot of different types of people in our life, and it's that extended family, colleagues at work, or even an online community can provide us all that we need to feel loved and supported. Loneliness has become a significant concern, especially during this pandemic times. A lot of people are taking the advice, and rightfully so, from the public health, and it's really finding the ability to balance what we need from a social perspective, especially as we're trying to be physically safe and keeping our loved ones and our community safe as well. But there are many things that we can do to ensure that we're reaching out. And the best advice I can give, and I give this quite often, is if you know of any person in your life, your community, your neighborhood, who may not be getting out as much as they should, reach out. We can all do it in a very safe manner by keeping our distance, but checking in on each other is a really good way to not only feel that you're giving, but also ensuring the safety and the health of others that are around us. Another element to build resiliency is we need to have a very powerful personal identity. How we are seen by others is crucial to our self-worth. Our identities are so important to us. So constantly evaluating who you are in the world and who you want to be is a skill, is an exercise in building this resilient mindset, that toughness that we talked about initially, of how to ensure that what you're putting out to the world coincides with your values and your beliefs. Because we do value what others see of us, but also more importantly, we value what we think of ourselves. So we need a very powerful identity. We need a sense of control. And my God, it's difficult right now in these very difficult times when we don't know, even from one week to the next, even from an industry perspective, what's going to be open, what's going to be closed, how it's going to affect you, your financial security, your family's financial security, to have a sense of control in our life. Well, in times that are unpredictable that we're all facing right now, what are the little things that we can do to control certain aspects of our lives? It can be little things of setting of those routines, as we mentioned earlier. It can be setting a specific time in which you engage with others, either via Skype, Zoom, FaceTime, whatever it may be. But having that sense of control over who I am, what I'm doing in my life, how can I predict and build structure for the next phase of whatever this pandemic is going to throw at us, will all help us have that better sense of control and reduce the level of stress in our life. You're not going to remove it, but it's working through stress that becomes manageable is the key here. We also need a sense of belonging. And for many people, where that comes from is religious affiliation, spirituality. It can be culture. It can be a life purpose. Whatever it may be and wherever it comes from, and however it's nuanced, it is important to know that we're connected to something outside of ourselves. Especially during a crisis, feeling like our life has a purpose, that we have meaning, and that people depend on us helps us through those stressful times. Another element is we need rights and responsibilities. It is very difficult to experience success unless we experience social justice. It's important that we are given genuine responsibilities for our own and others' welfare. In times where we question some of the social injustices that we see every day, and it can be from any topic. I mean, all we have to do is put on the news, and there is an issue that we as a society, as Canadians, have to deal with. And having those difficult conversations of where do I see myself in this role that is front and center right now, that is important and is affecting us as a culture, as a society, as people who work in certain organizations, as Canadians. Where do I stand? And how I can make a meaningful change is very, very important in building that resilient mindset. So it really comes down to, again, to this exercise where we have to ask ourselves, what role do I want to play in my life, in my community, in my country? We also need what's called safety and support. We have to know that our homes and our community are safe. And this goes hand in hand with knowing what role do we want to play. In times where we don't feel safe, we question our ability to know what to do and how to cope. So without these, we can become very easily overwhelmed. So knowing how to set up a safe environment is key to resiliency. We need to think positive. Now, how do we think positive when so much is coming at us? There's two. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the coming minutes, but just to introduce this, thinking about life in a positive manner all the time. If anybody's out there that can teach me how to do it, I would love to know. But it's challenging. We often try our hardest to think in a positive way. And a lot of us, and most of us, are very successful at it. But every now and then, pessimism comes in. That glass half full sentiment comes in, where you feel like, I just can't take one more thing. Try our hardest to think in a positive way. And a lot of us, and most of us, are very successful at it. But every now and then, pessimism comes in. That glass half full sentiment comes in, where you feel like, I just can't take one more thing. And how do I give up? Do I just throw in the towel? How do I get through this? Research has shown just by thinking and switching our thoughts of I can overcome this. I can get through this. This is not going to break me. This is going to be challenging, but I know I have the fortitude to get through this. Those simple techniques of thinking positively will allow us to better adapt to the stress environment that is coming at us. And it's a simple thing. I'm not saying it's an easy thing, but changing our mindset into the positive is really, and the science behind it shows, is an effective way to not only build resiliency, but help us adapt to the stress and overcome it more quickly with less negative effects. So, last two things in summary on Dr. Unger's really, really great research that he's synthesized is we need to be physically well and we need to be financially well. That's not always easy, but it's a way to demonstrate the little things that we can do. When it comes to physical activity, we all can do things in our own home, especially now with most areas in Canada. I think gyms are closed. There are things that we can do that are cost effective and allow us to get that physical activity. There's such a connection between our physical health and our mental health. And when people become physically active, it has so many positive benefits on our mental health and building that ability and that exercise towards resiliency. And on the financial piece, I know this is a very, very challenging times for many people. And going back to some of the concepts around control, how do I make little steps, even as simple as building up a budget, of knowing what means do I have this month, where do I need to put my resources, even those little small steps can help us not feel overwhelmed with some of the financial considerations a lot of people right now are facing. So those are very quick snapshots on building resiliency. Now, I want to dive into a little bit more on each of them and synthesize it in a way from another researcher out of the United States. And digressing for 1 second before I forget, if anybody is interested in the references behind the science in which I'm talking about tonight, please email Daryl and the KIP Foundation, and I will provide any and all references material for building really resiliency. There are great books out there that are not only talk about the science, but have really good anecdotal information, have case studies, have examples that really, really help a reader understand the science behind this. So to summarize a little bit more on another wonderful researcher, like I said, out of the US, is now let's talk about a little bit more in depth of what we mean by this optimism. And optimism ignites resiliency. But how really do we define what optimism is? It's typically, we talk about optimism as future oriented. We look to the future to possibly solve our problems, to look for better days ahead. But what it really comes down to is a confidence that things will work out. And people who have a resilient mindset believe in that confidence that things will work out. It also means that if you try hard enough, you will succeed. Pessimism, on the other hand, when we think about those who have a pessimistic mindset, their view is that the future is dim, that they believe that things will happen to them no matter what they do, that there's nothing that they can do to avoid the pitfalls and the stress that comes at them from life. Simply put, optimisms and pessimistic individuals, they differ on expectations. So what really can we do? Well, it literally comes down to changing our perspective. When we look to the future and we look to where we would like to be, then we work out how we're going to get there. But we also have to be very realistic because blind optimism isn't the same thing. Examining life kind of through rose-colored glasses does not bring about resiliency. Being realistic means that when we're faced with negative information or events, people who have optimism from a realistic perspective, they don't remain focused on the negative. They disengage from that very, very rapidly, and they look to what is right before me that I can solve today, right now. And I look to the future of what steps can I put in place to achieve my goal in the end. So it's being realistic. So it means having a broad perspective and attention to the things around you that you can use effectively to step by step methodically figure out where I need to go. It's looking at the resources around you. It's asking for help. It's reaching out to resources in our community when you don't know what the next step should be. It's viewing things when, or essentially, sometimes we have to take a step back and we go, not sure where to go to next, but there are multiple resources around me to get me there. But it's the want to get there. So having a realistic optimism, I'm having a hard time saying that today, optimism really is key in developing that resilient mindset. So how do we do that? We focus on the positive things around us. And if we look, they're always there. We intentionally think positive thoughts and try very hard not to dwell on the negative. We all do it, but when we get into that negative mindset, training yourself to go, okay, I've done that long enough. Now, how am I going to get out of this? That's thinking positively. We can also reframe the negative and interpret events in a more positive light. We can also behave in active ways that build positive feelings. I'm going to share a story that I don't share with many people. But one thing I do to get me into that mindset, especially if nobody's looking, I put music on and I dance. It's really hard to be in a negative frame of mind if you're enjoying the music, you're enjoying the moment, and you're dancing. So that works for me. And that's a secret that I hope nobody shares with anybody else. But if we all do those little things that work for you, then you can easily get into that reframing, knowing where to go for the next step. Another element that comes into building resiliency, and it is so important right now, is facing our fears. No one can hide from fear. It can strike anybody at any time. It can strike the people who we say are the most courageous. It can strike all of us. And we often don't even know when it's going to come. For me, the biggest fear that I faced this year with the pandemic, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, was, do I send my daughter back to school? How do I make that decision? And the fear of her contracting this illness was overwhelming for me. She's my only daughter. She's my life. She's my world. And coming up with a rational decision based on that fear was very, very challenging. Her father and I sat for hours debating the pros and cons, but I found it really hard to work through because I kept coming back to the fear. What if something happened? What if I made a decision and then she's negatively affected by it? What if? And fear, as the example I just gave, can paralyze us. It's constricting. It is devastating for a lot of us. For some, it can be energizing. it can be served as a catalyst for growth. But for a lot of individuals who have difficulty building the reserves up, building effective strategies to deal with stress, fear can be paralyzing. So when we encounter something that frightens us, we react with the urge to defend ourselves, run away. It's that old fight flight response. But in our society, the things that cause us fear are typically not things we can run away from. When it comes to stress, our body, as I said last week, produces chemicals, hormones, neurotransmitters that make our body react in a very predictable way. But these things also become activated when we experience fear. So in my situation of dealing with what do I do with my daughter, I felt I couldn't think through rationally what I should do, what her dad and I should do. How do we as a family make the right decision? What's interesting about the biologic response to fear and stress is that the same regions that are activated when we're fearful or stressed also are the same regions that are that help us develop memories. So why this is important, the link is if we face many fearful, stressful events in our life, our brain adapts and it builds the context around those fearful and stressful situations, and it builds memories. What happens is that the context around when that fear response was triggered becomes ingrained into us. So the next time we're in a situation in which we become fearful or stressed, our body automatically responds of, I recognize the situation. I need to protect everything around this individual, and I need to either fight or flee. Well, in short, although this is so important for us to survive, it really can wear us down because chronic fear is counterproductive to our well-being. It manifests itself sometimes as stomach upset, overeating, weakening our immune systems, not sleeping, decreased in interest in physical activities, decreased interest in intimate relationships. It can also cause anxiety and depression. It can also lead to heart disease because our blood pressure remains high. It can affect our heart rate, cholesterol levels, sugar levels, all of these things. Why is this so important? Because learning to overcome fear is essential for resilience. We can teach ourselves to focus on our thinking and our behaviors. From the experience in researching in military contexts, using fear to build resiliency, what they've used the fear to be is a guide to what to do next. It allows us to see the fear as a chance, not to avoid something, but rather look at it as a chance to grow or an opportunity to learn from the event. For some, we can manage our fears using simple techniques such as breathing. For anybody who wants to know what we call either tactical breathing or meditative breathing, why it can help us refocus in a very stressful and fearful event is it's really hard to think clearly if we're in an activated state. So from a biological response, we can turn off that stress response by breathing. And it's a simple technique, is breathe in for 4 seconds, hold it for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, and hold for 4. And I always think I'm doing this, it's like a square. And doing that even a few times I recommend trying to do it for at least 30 seconds, but if you can do it for several minutes, that without a doubt will calm your body down so that you can rationally think through the next steps. Because again, with stress, what it does from that predictable biologic response is it kicks in those mechanisms that, okay, I got to run or I got to fight. What it doesn't allow us to do is think clearly because we have no time to think. So breathing or meditation, whatever it may be, just calming your mind will allow you to more rationally think what I need to do and overcome the fear, whatever it is that's causing it. Another element that's really, really important, and we touched on it earlier, but let's dive into it a little bit more, is what does it mean to have a moral compass? In today's world, that is a question I know a lot of us ask ourselves. In the moral climate of today, the one thing I ask myself, and I know some people do, has it changed? Is it different from our parents? Is it different from our grandparents? We live in a world that is foreign to several generations ago. We live in an instant gratification world. I struggle with that because when my daughter says, "Can I order something on Amazon so it can be here by tomorrow morning?" That is instant gratification. We, as a society, struggle with the wonderfulness of Amazon showing up at our door with whatever it is we need versus let's work for it. Let's wait for it. And we are also saturated in our media that is so full of pressure. It's pressure to act in a certain way, dress in a certain way, speak in a certain way. And even more so, it is driven by power, money, sex, and violence. So, with all of that going on, from thinking of it from a resilient point of view, how do we define ourselves both morally and ethically? How do we take ourselves in the context of everything that's going on and say, who am I? And if we don't know who we are, it's very difficult to know where to navigate, where to have a perspective on something, where to take a stand, how to take a stand. So I challenge everyone to think about defining what your moral compass is. What feels right for you? Because the research on resiliency demonstrates that those who possess a really keen sense of right and wrong have, when those are defined very well for an individual, these are strengthened during times of extreme stress. And ability to know how to react and what to do next is more effective in those who have that strong sense of what's right and wrong and having that strong moral compass.